Good morning, everybody. Oh, I heard one. Good morning. Good morning, Wafa. How about anybody else? Good morning? There we go. Fantastic. I hope you all had a chance to grab a coffee, something to eat, maybe just a small bite. And the four of us up here are super excited to have this discussion. We just agreed we're bringing the energy, we're bringing the white here as well too. It was not planned, not coordinated. There was no memo that went out, but really excited about this opportunity to begin this discussion on a topic that is so relevant and so important to patient engagement. The title of this session is If We Don't Measure It, Does It Count? Operationalizing Patient Engagement Metrics. So let me pause for a minute and just read this through to you. There's an old philosophical, well, let's start that again. There's an old philosophical question. If a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Well, in patient engagement, we might ask a slightly different question. If meaningful patient engagement happens, but nobody measures it, nobody captures it, nobody demonstrates its impact, does it count inside an organization? So imagine this scenario. A company invests heavily in patient engagement over several years. Patients contribute insights, their trial designs improve, teams feel inspired, relationships strengthen. But no metrics are defined, no outcomes are tracked, no evidence is captured, and no impact is reported internally. That's what we're here to discuss today, is to better understand how within all of our organizations, whether that be industry, whether that be within the patient community and patient organizations, how can we consider metrics, KPIs, to think about tracking the impact of patient engagement? This, as you may know, is part of track number 2, where we're looking at various different themes. And here in this particular session, we're looking specifically around standard setting and how can we think about metrics in a similar way. We've got a great lineup of speakers that will introduce themselves in just a moment. And very quickly then to go through the agenda, you may be familiar with those of you that have been to POF before. We'll follow a similar pattern where we have some panel discussions. We'll move into co-creation. We'll think about the idea of moving towards a core metric, a core metric set. And then we'll have some feedback and wrap up. But first, we promised to bring the energy. So, are you ready? Are you guys ready? All right, let's move to a little bit of an icebreaker. I would like you to think about if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Join a table, answer the question. You've got 2 minutes to discuss. Ready? Those people that are sitting in chairs, please feel free to discuss amongst yourselves or move to a table. Exactly. 10 seconds. 9, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, if I can have your attention back here, please. Hopefully it was a fun exercise. I heard some laughter. I can hear the chatter now. It sounds like it sparked some interesting questions. We certainly have an interesting discussion up here. One of our panelists, I'm not going to point out who, shared another opportunity to a different scenario. Instead of a tree falling in a forest, in other parts of the world, there's a different analogy that's used. And so I encourage you to speak with Kirsten after the session, and she could share with you what that analogy is. It's not necessarily appropriate to share on a big stage, so you can talk to Kirsten afterwards. So a little bit of fun. Let's move on to today's objectives. So what are we looking to do here? Of course, as we've set the scene, it's really thinking about reviewing patient engagement, the metrics and evaluation, and some of the trends. What are we seeing? What are we hearing? As a team member of PFMD, then I certainly have an opportunity to hear from industry, from patient organizations, from regulators as well around what does this look like. We're going to talk about some very practical examples for implementing metrics, some great case studies, some great examples that you'll hear from our panelists. And then ultimately with our co-creation exercise, we'll be digging a little bit deeper to make it even more practical. Along that line, some of you, and I think actually quite a few of you in the room, have been on this journey with us over the last number of years. And so this is an initiative through PFMD where we have a project that has been focusing on metrics, monitoring, and evaluation for a number of years. A few years back, we launched the Metrics Selector, which is available on Synapse, a tool that looks at various different metrics to be able to be used in a number of different contexts. From there, we've had various different publications and white papers, even thinking about how do we talk about ESG and sustainability and think about metrics for patient engagement that can be included in that aspect as well. We've had a number of different POF sessions. We've done workshops at various other events as well too. And most recently, we had a white paper with some analysis looking at commitments from pharmaceutical companies, specifically around publicly available commitments. And what we looked at, on the next slide you'll see 24 different companies, publicly available reports to see the types of commitments and metrics that were being used by companies but available publicly. And what we found was that these metrics and these commitments were actually along a continuum. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there was reference to patient benefit commitments. And so things like the number of countries with access to medications. So the patient benefits from it, but on the other end of the continuum is thinking about patient engagement commitments, thinking about more where patients are actively inputting, partnering, and being involved with trial protocols or involved in some capacity. So that full continuum. I'm going to pause there for a moment because on the next slide, I'll show you a few of the results. One question for you, and just by a show of hands, when you look at either the patient benefit commitments or the patient engagement commitments, what do you anticipate most companies were publicly reporting on? So if you think it was the patient benefits, you can raise your hand. So, okay. And if you think it was the patient engagement commitments, raise your hand. Okay, so overwhelmingly, people felt it was the patient benefit commitments. I was just as surprised. It's not. It's actually more than the 100 and so commitments that we analyzed actually were patient engagement commitments, which is really surprising. But what it demonstrates, I think, is really the evolution and the thinking that's going now into much more comprehensive patient engagement and partnering. You can see there a couple of the examples for the types of commitments that came up more prevalent. And interesting part as well is that these commitments only 26% of them were actually tied to metrics. So it's great that companies are saying, yes, we commit to this, and yes, we commit to that. But really, how do we know that? How can you demonstrate that? And what is the impact of measuring that as well? Beyond that, then part of this discussion that we've had, again, through the various conversations, is that we're seeing various different opportunities and where we're thinking and moving beyond just anecdotes to more systematic operationalization of metrics. So for example, the feedback that we've received in these conversations is a need for really concise, standardized metrics that could be used either within companies, between companies, within patient organizations, for example, or even between as well. Thinking about organizational adoption and implementation of metrics across different functions. And the third one, connecting metrics to key priorities or decision points. How are we using those metrics and the impact to actually help with strategic decision making? And then finally, measuring the influence of patient engagement in healthcare, either through mathematical modeling or also through retrospective comparison. There's an interesting report that came out, will be coming out, and I'm not sure if there's anybody in the audience here from Boehringer Ingelheim. Anybody? No, Butaka, yes. And so at a recent Patients as Partners conference in London, there were speakers from BI and shared that will be published some really interesting retrospective data where they looked at where patients were involved in clinical trial protocol design and where they were not. And what they showed was that it was actually recruitment was 205 days faster with patient engagement involvement, probably not surprising to any of us, but the fact that it's quantified. Next, there was a 46% relative reduction in dropouts. So in terms of retention, it was higher. And that equated to almost 30 million euros in savings. It's huge. And what's so fascinating about this is great new data, as opposed to where we've often had to look in publications back to 2017, 2018, again, with many of the publications that you are familiar with. So the things are really moving, things are really exciting, and this is a perfect opportunity now to turn to our panelists and have them share as well some of the really great insights and opportunities that they are seeing within their own companies. So first, I'd like to introduce Kirsten from Sanofi, who will share a little bit more about what Sanofi has been working really hard on in terms of the patient promise and what that means in terms of metrics. So Kirsten, please.
Good morning, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be here and wonderful to see all your smiling faces. I love the POF meeting. I think it's what gives me energy. I work internally quite a bit. As Haley said, I'm at Sanofi, and my job is to really monitor and create often the rules and the tools and the templates, the systems by which we engage with the community. And so it's ended up being very internally focused, as I said, and so the opportunity to come here and get to see this energy is a real pleasure, so thank you.
Fabulous, Kirsten. Thank you so much. And maybe if you can take a little bit of time now to share in terms of your experience, what it was like to develop the patient promise. If you can give the audience a little bit of that context, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it's helpful, just a quick level set for how Sanofi's organized, because every pharmaceutical company is going to approach this differently. But we have a decentralized model. And so what that means is that for our external engagement, that is largely driven in terms of the strategy that we want to approach the patient community with. That is largely driven by public affairs. But in terms of patient engagement internally, that is not driven by public affairs. It's driven by the function that needs that patient engagement. And so while medical teams may often think about engaging patients for a program to develop evidence generation over the life cycle. Public affairs is not going to do that for medical. Medical needs to know how to do that, how to make smart decisions about it, and even how to do basics like contract a patient. And if you go into R&D where we do a significant amount of engagement, it's the same thing. Public affairs is not doing that for R&D. R&D needs to know how to do that for themselves. The exception would be with patient advocacy groups where we really do try to keep public affairs front and center because, of course, we don't want to inundate our partner organizations with 20 million requests. But the reason we've done that is that public affairs, we don't have a standalone patient engagement function. So public affairs is accountable for, as I said, that strategy, but they're also accountable for government affairs, policy, everything like that. So one of the reasons that we thought about a concept like the patient promise and something that spanned the life cycle is that we really needed our colleagues across the organization to be on board with this concept, to really help us realize our vision for integrated patient engagement, because public affairs on no planet could have done this alone. And so when we put together the promise, again, it is across the life cycle where we make commitments starting early in development and all the way along to post-launch. And at every stage, there's different functions that really had to be part of realizing that promise. And so by putting a public commitment out there, having it endorsed by the XCOM, we kind of nicely said, you've got to do this whether you want to or not. And so it's been this was a bit of an area where we started with more of a stick. It's become a carrot over time, but it definitely was a bit of an intention to kind of hold people accountable for doing what we know they needed to do.
Fabulous, Kirsten. And can you share, and as you can see on the screen here, we've put up the Sanofi patient promise there. And I think what's fascinating with the work that you've done is really incorporate metrics. You've really thought very consciously about what is it that you're going to report on publicly. Can you talk a little bit about that process, and then ultimately, what do you do with the metrics? What do you do with that, with those insights, and how does that further inform moving forward?
Yeah, the text of the promise was developed with a lot of different groups, and that was kind of the easy part, I would say. Developing metrics, we brought together 10 internal leaders and then 10 external leaders to really say, what can we measure that would say, yes, we did this commitment. And that was hard. There was a lot of things that the patient community wanted us to measure that we just flat out did not have the infrastructure to do. A real basic was on some of the financial reporting, and we have over 100 different financial systems in Sanofi, which is crazy. But you're in 100 countries, 80,000 employees. Not every system talks to each other. What they do and monitor and measure and how they record POs in Turkey is not how they do it in the U.S. And so there were some things that we just literally could not get our arms around the data. So it was a real back and forth. But at the end of the day, the metrics that we determined were metrics that were we were trying to not just have a number, but also have the ability to show what the impact was. And so the data that we have here is that we're showing on the screen. Every single clinical trial protocol is informed by patients. What I never knew is that there's multiple protocols that are developed. I'm not a researcher, but you start with something initially and it's refined over time, and then at some point you do what are called abbreviated protocols. And so what we had to work with the teams to do is not just how many of those were informed, but what did you do with that information? And so that's what you see here. It's like what was changed because you received input from a patient. And we're trying to do that very consistently with all of our metrics, but we'll be launching the 2025 report next week, and you'll see we're only about halfway there. There's metrics where we can say this is what was changed, this was the impact, this was what was different because we asked those questions. There's other metrics, a lot of them in the regulatory area and in the market access area, where we can say what we did. We can't yet measure whether or not that had impact. Some of that it's because it's an external body that is determining whether or not that was impactful, but some of it is that we're just not there yet in terms of the data capture.
Thank you, Kirsten. I think it's fascinating to see the transparency by which you are sharing the quantitative data behind that as well. And as you've said, in terms of being able to reflect on that and ultimately how that might impact moving forward. In terms of not only the external communication, but also internally. And Monia, I think this is a good time to turn to you in terms of the work that you're doing as well. And maybe you'd like to take a moment to just introduce yourself and also share a little bit about Novartis, because you've really looked at this externally, but also internally and various different ways of monitoring and thinking about metrics. So I'll turn the floor to you.
Absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Monia Steenakers, and I'm leading the patient engagement capability building efforts, as well as our patient engagement tools and platforms. And last but not least, everything around impact measurement. I'm very happy to be here and to share my experience. So, yeah, so basically, like Sanofi and many other companies, Novartis also has its own commitment to patients and caregivers. An initiative that was created 8 years ago and co-created basically in partnership with 40 patient organizations. So every year on the 14th of February, so Valentine's Day, we publish our new fact sheet with our new data. It's very important to mention, as Kirsten mentioned, that this is not a patient engagement public commitment, it's a Novartis one. So we basically publish or disclose more than patient engagement data. It also includes access, etc. And there is a QR code in case you are interested to know more about it. Now, yesterday I heard from one of our panelists in the HTA discussions, if you cannot track, you cannot measure. And this is exactly why we have those other internal measurement tools. So let me introduce you to those three platforms. So first of all, we have our heat map. So our heat map is basically a portfolio level visualization, which basically provide an overview of all our development programs and assets across the development stages. And it helps our patient engagement team to plan and prioritize their efforts. Now, most importantly, we use this heat map not only to plan what we are going to do, but also to communicate that extremely clearly to our business partners about what will happen, and also drive alignment on priorities, which is extremely important. Then we have our patient engagement progress tool. And our patient engagement progress tool is a structure framework which serve three purposes. And Haley, you addressed this already a little bit at the beginning of the panel. So first of all, it enables us to track and demonstrate how progress has been made. So basically capturing what has been done and not done. So for example, patient input into our TPP, patient engagement, patient experience data into our clinical overviews, etc. And it really supports communication and also build a strong corporate memory about what patient engagement is doing. But it also allows us to assess whether programs that include a patient perspective component perform differently, which allow us also to basically move towards more outcome-based measurements, which is, as you can imagine, important. And then last but not least, it also provides visibility on our on our capacity. So basically, it's help to show to the leadership team how many programs we have been able to support with the resource that we have, and where do we still have gaps. And then last but not least, as you can see on the screen, we also have impact cards. So those impact cards is basically a one-slide summary, which basically capture how patient engagement has directly influenced decision and outcomes. So they basically translate patient engagement activities into clear decision-based evidence, showing what changed as a result of patient input. So it can be protocol design, endpoint selection, etc. So basically with those four tools, we can communicate effectively internally and externally about what was done, how well it was done, and what changed as a result.
Thank you, Monia, for walking us through the various different ways that Novartis is looking to be able to track and monitor in the use of metrics. When I first heard this overview, when we were preparing for this panel and the discussions, I was really intrigued by these impact cards, because that is something that is very much, as we've talked about before, we're moving from anecdotal to more operationalization of metrics, of making things quantifiable, percentages, numbers, increases, decreases. The impact cards, from what I understand, are more qualitative, and that is just as important within Novartis to understand that. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about those impact cards and where you've seen that grow.
Yeah, so we basically moved from, I mean, in the old days, the question was, do we need to engage patients? And nowadays, the question is more, are we engaging patients early enough, consistently enough, and are we doing it in the right way to really inform decisions? And this is exactly what our senior leadership want to see, right? And the only way to be able to do that is, of course, like Boehringer, to be able to put some data behind, but also to use those qualitative metrics. So at the beginning, people were a little bit skeptical because they had the impression that it was difficult to use in decision making, but over time we have really seen an increasing acceptance, and especially whether it is linked to concrete use cases and also structure into decision relevant insight. If this is the case, then it's very well received. And we have, for example, last week at the Patient as Partner conference, our head of clinical development, who is basically our boss, who came to speak. So he was one of the panelists and used, for example, some of those examples in his speech. So I think it's resonate and it stick in the mind of our senior leaders.
Absolutely, and I think it's that complementary effort between the quantitative, the qualitative, the narrative, the storytelling, but being really strategic in how those are used for decision-making internally, and also sharing externally the commitments that companies are making. Thank you. Mandy, I'd like to turn to you now too, because as a representative of the patient organization, patient community, you've been listening to this. And I'd like you to take a moment to introduce yourself, and then maybe just a couple of comments that, as you've heard Kirsten and Monia share what companies are doing, how does that resonate for you as a patient organization and a representative of the patient community?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm Mandy St. Cooler with an organization called Mended Hearts, and we're based in the United States. And we're a cardiovascular organization, so we support people who are living with and affected by all types of cardiovascular disease across the lifespan, so pediatric and adult. And I've been with the organization for 14 years, and we've been around for 75, so we're a peer-to-peer support organization. And I think, what struck me, I guess, about the conversation is that you're still looking at a very high level bird's eye view. And your comment then about your boss who came on and gave some concrete examples, that is very much appreciated because that's the world that we're living in. We're looking at very specific examples when we're talking to our members, whether we're talking to partners or funders. We do need the data, but we also need that anecdotal evidence as well. So it's a nice balance between the two. But I applaud the work you're doing, and we're in such a different place than we were than I started 14 years ago, that we get to have these conversations.
Absolutely, and I think some of the conversations you and I have had too, Mandy, is recognizing that it's important to see the impact for patient engagement from an industry perspective, but there's also impacts for patient organizations. And I'm wondering, from your perspective and the work that you're doing at Mended Hearts, do you actually think about the metrics or evaluating and thinking about the impact that your community is having for either working with industry, with regulators, or can you share a little bit about what either you may be thinking or possibly doing that.
And I was pretty honest in my conversation with you in that we don't have a lot of time to think about that impact. We know it's important and we try to do it in as many places as we can, but you are so in the moment every day just trying to keep your head above water that you don't have a chance to think about it, which is why it's really important to have those pieces set up and that structure set up so that we don't have to think about it. We can just automatically engage with it and be able to access that data or those anecdotes when we need to. And so one of the things I shared yesterday is that our industry partners, I forget what you said the term was that deal with the patient organizations. It's a different group in every industry, right? It's a different group and they change just like we change. And so you don't have that long-term relationship to go back and remember how you engaged with that company 10 years ago on a certain product that's now come to market. And those products take 15 to 20 years sometimes. So you don't get to see in a sequential way what your impact has been on that product development. And so the need to have that reporting at the end so that we can go back and reflect on how we've participated and made a difference and how our patients have, that's super important. It's just, we're not set up to deal with it at a big level.
And very interesting that what you shared, and I'm sure this is reflected in many of you from the audience as well too, in terms of having the capacity and being able to think through, okay, what actually does this take? We've heard from industry the amount of resources, the time, et cetera, that it needs to implement that as well too. Very interesting to hear as well the idea that if there were metrics and there was a standardized way of being able to look at that could be implemented, standardized, and be able to do that sort of benchmarking or comparison and to see what that looks like. I think in terms of the following up there, then what other types of supports, what other types of collaborations would be helpful for you from a patient organization perspective to better understand the impact that your community is having as well?
Yeah, I think the connections not just with your patient advocacy partner within industry, but also those introductions to medical and other departments within the pharma or the med tech company is super helpful because then you get to talk about your point of view and you get to hear back from them how patient input has been helpful in their position as well. And I think, there are some key areas here in terms of underserved communities and increasing participation and women in clinical trials and underserved communities, making them more diverse. Those are some areas that if we had that data to back up, to show, look how much better this trial has done because of the strategies you've taken. If we could share that with our members, that could help, persuade people to participate in clinical trials who are hesitant to do so because of mistrust or other reasons. And it's not always data that's going to do that. Sometimes it's the stories that do that are attached to the data. But that's one reason why if you get pushback within your companies, not wanting to share data, well, we could help. If we had some of that to share, we could help persuade our members to maybe participate or understand why their input's valuable.
Monia and then Kirsten, as you're listening to what Mandy's sharing from a patient organization perspective, what comes to mind for each of you in terms of how there may be opportunities for further collaboration, further support in terms of what Mandy has shared?
Yeah, I think there is indeed this external accountability, right? And this is also why we have our commitment, because I think it's important that when we engage with patients, that we have this feedback loop and that we can also share with them how their input was valuable into our program and how things have evolved because of that. I think that in terms of collaboration, I think we are, although you are part of a patient organization and I'm part of a company, I have the impression that some of the issues are quite similar, right? Because at the end, tracking all the things that we are doing take time, also on our side, right? And of course, which is a pity to somehow to see is that we are still obliged to use those anecdotal examples or those impact cards to demonstrate the value of patient engagement. And I hope that at some point, this won't be needed anymore, and that it will become like when we engage with HEPs, a common practice, and that nobody will challenge basically whether or not it is important to engage with patients, and that at the end we don't really need all those metrics. But for now, I think it's important, and we can definitely partner together, like you said, if those metrics help patients or patient participants to stay on the trial or to participate in a trial. I think that's where we can basically make a difference together.
I think I've been recently struck by the need to come back to the storytelling a bit. And when we met, I'd written down your great idea on the impact cards. But, you know, for a while, it felt like we really needed the data to justify that this is important, this matters, this is relevant. And, you know, some people intuitively got it, a lot of others didn't. And we've really been in this like, pull back, how do we capture it, how do we measure it, how do we show the impact, can we quantify it in dollars, can I tie a dollar amount to this, you know, all of that. And I think now we're getting our hands around how we can do that. And I have noticed a need to come back to storytelling. And, you know, one of the things that we've run into recently is, you know, our R&D teams are doing an amazing job, but they don't talk to every single patient group out there in the world when they're pulling together a clinical trial. You know, they'll talk to 10 or 15, and there may be 300 groups. And so that idea of an impact card, the storytelling, because if we didn't work with you, you know, you may not necessarily know, yeah, and your community deserves to know that patients, you know, the larger community really did have impact on something, because even if you weren't the person in the room talking, that really does matter to you. And so I've really been, again, just kind of gravitating back towards how do we tell that story better so that it isn't just impacting the people who were involved, but there's a wider sense of it.
I can just add, I fully agree also with Mandy on the fact that we should be the bridge between our cross-functional functions and our patient partners. I have realized also that when our cross-functional partners are in direct contact with our patient partners or have the possibility to really directly ask questions, that most of the time the one who were reluctant to do those kind of activities become completely convinced. And usually it's not because of data, it's just because of what they heard and directly from the community. So I think that we should do that more consistently, not treat patient engagement as an isolated activity and then send a report to our cross-functional partners, but really actively engage them in the preparation of the ad board or the questions that they want to ask, etc. I think that's extremely important.
I have seen some great best practices over the last few years with the industry partners that we meet consistently with, monthly, bi-monthly, and their excitement to bring in their cross-functional teams. And they are willing to do that. We hear from medical, we hear from policy, we've heard from their commercial teams and marketing teams. So we get to share what we're doing and learn from them. So it's happening, and it just needs to, I guess, continue to happen and grow.
Fantastic. I don't know about the audience, but hearing this conversation, I find it really inspiring. We're in a different place now than we were last year, than we were 5 years ago, and certainly, you know, even before that. There is progress. Things are moving, things are evolving, whether it's through thinking about the metrics, the storytelling, the narratives that are coming into play, and the collaboration as well, too, that's opening up and being able to consider more of that. I'd like to pause here for just a couple of minutes to potentially take a couple of questions for the panelists. Before I do, and I think I can see Corey over there. So Corey's just sitting. Thanks, Clem. I'll let Corey introduce herself, but this is sort of an add-on panelist, shall I say. Corey and I have known each other for a few years now, and she brings a really interesting perspective, but actually from med device, med tech, which is, again, evolving, maturing. And so, Corey, I know you've been working very closely at Medtronic on metrics and thinking about what that means externally, internally. As you hear this discussion, how does it resonate for you at Medtronic and from a medtech perspective?
First of all, thank you for letting me speak. My name is Corey Ju. I am a Senior Director of Clinical Research and Medical Science at Medtronic. For those of you who don't know, yes, we're a device company. We have 14 operating units, and we sell, a vast array of medical devices into a bunch of different therapy areas. And so part of my job is leading our patient engagement initiative, which is part of a broader program at the company around patient centricity in general. So there's a cultural aspect and there's this engagement aspect that I lead. I'm inspired, to see, 100% of your clinical trials have patient engagement. I mean, it's something we could only dream of right now. We're very much in our infancy. Device is very different than pharma in a lot of ways, and you can understand that lots of physicians use our devices or they implant them in patients. And so for years, we have relied on physicians and clinicians for input and as proxy for the patient. And there are still people that believe that we can't avoid talking to clinicians, we have to. But there's people that push back that why should I talk to a patient like the physician is implanting the device. So we have pushback in that regard. So it's inspiring to see how much headway that you've all made. And we are trying to do similar things about the insights, tracking the insights and what you changed based on what you heard. We are doing it across the product life cycle, and also new for a device is direct-to-consumer marketing, which we've never really done before, which now I don't know about in Europe, but in the US, drug companies, it's direct-to-consumer marketing all the time. And so that's new for device as well. And so now we're getting patient input on our direct-to-consumer marketing messaging. And one thing that we have done, and this is about to be published, is we've developed an organizational-wide patient centricity index that is incorporated into our broader organizational health survey, which you all probably have too in industry. It's yearly sent out to all employees, and there's different indices in it about engagement, innovation, ethics, and we got patient centricity added as a fourth index. And it's really the employee perception of the patient centricity of the organization, and our leadership is taking it very seriously, and we actually saw it go up 2 points, which is huge for a company with 90,000 people, for us to see an increase like that. And we can't trace it to exactly everything we've done, but the last 2 years has been a big push. So that's a different index that we've developed aside from the metrics that go with each activity. We have this overarching index in the company now to see, like, are you perceiving that we're listening to patients, that they're informing our decision making, things like that. It's an index. It's only 6 questions, so it's not optimal, but it's something. But again, inspired by what you all are doing, but we are in a different environment in device. We have our different challenges, and the biggest one is the reliance on the clinician as the expert, and getting over that hurdle. And you can understand too, like, you have an insulin pump that a patient interacts with daily, hourly. And so those people in R&D realize the need to talk to a patient, but people that are making a surgical device don't see the need to talk to a patient. And there's a fit for purpose model there. We can't insist that they talk to patients if it's not appropriate, but the gray in between, we have a lot of opportunity.
Thank you, Corey, for sharing that slightly different perspective. I know you've put a lot of effort and commitment yourself, and certainly Medtronic as well too, into thinking about how patient engagement can certainly evolve from that. We'll just take 1 or 2 questions if anybody has anything. Oh, okay, well, maybe a few more than 1 or 2, but I think we'll limit it to 2, Clem, if we can, please. So a hand was raised in the middle there.
Hi, everybody. Many thanks for this nice presentation and experience. My question is about mainly for Novartis and Sanofi representative. As you are international company, how do you manage such KPIs, if I can say that, across the countries? Is it fed by each affiliate, each centers, or how do you manage that, knowing that there is different ecosystem, cultures, and so on?
This was actually the conversation I was having this morning with our digital team, because I'd like to say it's very sexy in AI and digital. It's a spreadsheet right now, and I literally have to call public affairs in every single country. Clementine was with us and helped with this, but we literally call every single person and follow up religiously. And this is why I say my job's incredibly internally focused right now, is that we don't have a good way to capture it. And it is just that human to human interaction. What did you do in your market? Can you talk to that brand team? We didn't hear anything from the Dupixent team on, you know, asthma, what were they doing? Can you send me that data? So it really is a lot of legwork right now, but I think that the more we're able to pull that together comprehensively, the more the company is seeing the need to invest in making this a lot more streamlined and digital. But as I mentioned earlier, those systems don't exist today, so it's kind of old school.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's really depending, of course, on the type of data that we are reporting. So in our commitment, we are covering different kind of data. Some of those data, like if I take the patient engagement one, all the patient engagement activities are happening on the global level, so basically driven by the global team. However, when it comes, for example, about the number of partners that we have engaged on a yearly basis, then of course we will we have a system which will allow us to count the number of contracts that we have generated and etc. If it's about access, again, it will be another team. So it's really a collaboration between global countries, teams to collect those data. We work more and more now with our ESG team because, of course, they are also reporting certain pieces, and we also don't want to have duplications of effort. They are also very rigorous on how they track data, so we also trying to benefit from their expertise as well. So yeah, it's really a collaboration.
Thank you both. Really appreciate the question, and I know there were several hands that were raised as well, but as you can see, we have to get to the co-creation. I know all of you are going to be available for questions afterwards as well. So let's move on to the co-creation, because hopefully this has sparked some insights and some inspiration for all of you as well too. Our co-creation activity is really thinking about how can we look at ways to progress on a core set of patient engagement metrics to demonstrate value. When we talk about this exploration, we are not anticipating that at the end of this session, great, we're going to walk out of here, we're going to have 10 metrics and off we go. This is more about how do we think about where we're at currently, some of the roadblocks, some of the challenges that we're experiencing, and how do we move beyond that? And really tying it into key stakeholder priorities. So from last year, for some of you that were at POF 2025, you may remember we had a session that was around metrics. The insights that I'm sharing on the screen right now are from that POF session, and we're actually going to build on it today. So what we asked last year was, who are the stakeholders that are most interested in measuring patient engagement? Through POF last year and through several additional workshops throughout the year, the consolidated response is the 3 core buckets of stakeholder groups. You can see the patient community, industry, and other. This does not mean that it's just the patient community, just industry. It's also all of the subcategories, all of the different functional areas that have an interest as well. When we looked across all of those stakeholder groups and all of those individual departments, functional areas, there were 3 shared priorities that came out on top of all of the other ones that were sort of nuanced depending on the stakeholder group. The 3 shared priorities listed in the blue box there are earlier and more systematic integration of patient or patient organization insights, faster and more efficient study execution, and finally, faster and more successful regulatory and HTA approval and patient access. You can see there is a thread there related to patient engagement, but it's not explicitly focused on patient engagement. We were trying to understand what were the priorities, what were the goals ultimately of these groups. What we're going to do today then is try to bring forward these key 3 priorities or 3 key goals and bring out patient engagement metrics that could support the achievement of those priorities and goals. So I'll walk you through the exercise here. What you can see at the top of this slide are the 3 stakeholder groups, the 3 priority areas. And so what we would like you to do in each of your tables, your groups, is reflect on the metrics that are currently used to think about those priorities, and then consider how do we layer on top of that a patient engagement lens or perspective. And more specifically, it's addressing 4 questions as we move along. So if we take priority 2 as an example, faster and more efficient study execution. The first question at your group, you'd ask yourselves, what are the indicators or the activities that currently inform this type of priority? So for example, it could be recruitment time. It could be requests by industry to patient organizations for support. Okay, we have some indicators, we have some activities of that particular priority. Moving on to the next question then, what are the common ways that you could actually measure that indicator? So in terms of recruitment time, how could you measure that? One of the ways would be to look at the first time, the time for the first patient to start the trial, or potentially for the last patient to finish the trial. Moving on from there, it's then suggesting how could a patient engagement lens actually be integrated into that type of metric or into that indicator. So it's thinking about the change in the number of patients per site, per month, when there was patient engagement involved in that. Then the last step is, okay, now let's translate that into a metric. So the change in recruitment time in trials with supporting patient engagement activities. That's one example. It's a process that we'd like you to work through based on 1 priority per table. So as a table, you would look, depending on your priority, around what are the current indicators and activities, what are the metrics, how do you layer a patient engagement lens to that, and then ultimately, what is that patient engagement metric? This is one way of moving things forward. Some of you, and I fully respect, some of you may be looking at this going, no way, this is not gonna work. And that's okay. If you feel strongly that the way of pulling forward these metrics is not the best way to do it, have a discussion at your table about a different way, a better way. How could we identify those metrics at the end of the day that support the priorities and goals of the stakeholders? At each of the tables, you will have one of the panelists. You will also have facilitators who are experts in this area as well too. So they will be able to help address questions, help move this progress and this conversation forward. I can see on your faces, I can't quite see it yet. I'm getting closer. There's a little bit more energy and interest and excitement in this. But here's the question. Are we set? Are we ready for this co-creation exercise? Okay, it's the same person. It's the same person that says good morning and says yes. Are we ready? Are we ready for this? All right, let's go for it. We'll set the timer and we'll discuss as a group. Your facilitators will come forward, and we wish you the best of luck to help us move this conversation forward. All right. Wonderful. I had the opportunity to sit and discuss with one table. I also briefly had an opportunity to listen in on some of the conversations at the other tables. We had planned on doing a reporting back, but in the interest of time, what I'd like to actually see is from all of you, based on this exercise, thumbs up, thumbs down. Not a real question, just how was this? Thumbs up? Okay, that's good. That's a good thing, and it's not, to be honest, it's not what I expected. Because I recognize that this was challenging. This was pushing you out of your comfort zone. And that's exactly what POF is for. How do we get out of our circles? How do we get back if we can't move forward? How do we continue to have these conversations in a very challenging way that we are challenging each other and saying, industry, why do you always get to set the metrics? What about patient organizations? Why shouldn't we be having some metrics to actually go back to industry? It's fascinating to hear the discussions, and I hope that you walk away from here with some sparks, with some insights, maybe one or two aha moments. What we will do now is take all of this, all of the Post-it notes, all of the papers, consolidate. We will do our best to make sure that we compile it in a way that reflects all of the great insights that each of you have shared, and we will share that back to each of you as well, too. That is all part of this metro line that we're on in terms of thinking about making metrics a key tool for intelligence gathering and for ultimately for strategic decision making. As I mentioned before, we've been on this path. We've created various tools and resources, white papers, and all of that with the discussion today at POF is now thinking about how can we move forward in terms of metrics? How can we think and move forward about strategic narratives and storytelling around the value of patient engagement? So I would like to give a huge round of applause for our panelists and our facilitators that had a very challenging job today. So thank you to all of you. I would also like to give a huge thanks to each one of you that saw the co-creation activity and went, oh shit. But you stuck with it. And we're going to have some great insights that we can report back. If you'd like to get involved, if you want to learn more about what we're doing in this space, please reach out. We're here all day. We're here tomorrow. So look forward to continuing the conversations. And now it's lunch. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy your afternoon, and we'll chat soon.